Prologue. A Bitter Winter, 1781. The American cause in the South hung by a thread. In August 1780, Horatio Gates, hailed as the victor of Saratoga, led the Southern army to ruin at Camden. Cornwallis smashed him utterly, scattering the Continentals, capturing supplies and sending Gates galloping from the field in shame. What remained of the revolution in the Carolinas was a threadbare force of survivors and militia, demoralized and beaten. George Washington, furious at the debacle, sent one of his finest generals south, Nathanael Greene. Greene was methodical, patient, and possessed a gift for keeping broken armies alive. When he surveyed the wreckage left by Gates, he knew at once that bold strokes alone would not save the South. He needed cunning, and he needed Daniel Morgan. Morgan had stepped back from command after Saratoga, worn down by illness and frustration with Congress, but Greene coaxed him from retirement, offering him a detached corps of Continentals, militia, and cavalry. Morgan accepted, bringing with him the scars of a lifetime in war, the lash marks from 500 strokes in his youth, the memory of captivity at Quebec, the triumph at Saratoga where his riflemen had helped topple Burgoyne's army. He was a commander who knew how to fight with the men he had, not the army he wished for. Greene divided his force to confuse Cornwallis. While he shadowed the British to the east, he sent Morgan westward from the area around Charlotte into the Carolina backcountry. There Morgan gathered militia, harried outposts, and threatened Cornwallis's flank. Cornwallis could not ignore him. To destroy Morgan, he unleashed Banastre Tarleton. Tarleton drove his legion forward at breakneck pace, a hound on the scent, determined to crush Morgan before he escaped across the rivers. Morgan, retreating steadily, studied the ground, weighed his men, and chose his place. At a cattle pasture known locally as the Cowpens, the two forces would meet. Tarleton believed he had cornered his prey. Morgan knew he had set the stage for one of the most brilliant reversals in the annals of war. Chapter 1. The Hunters and the Hunted. The chase began in earnest after Christmas. Cornwallis, restless in his winter camp, resolved that his young cavalry commander would hound Daniel Morgan into the ground. Banastre Tarleton received the order with relish. He had long grown impatient with Greene's elusive army, always retreating, never standing still to be beaten. Here at last was an opponent exposed, a detachment of Continentals and militia under a man too sick and too stubborn to flee far. Tarleton pressed his troops hard. The green-coated dragoons, who followed him, were accustomed to long marches, but even they began to mutter as he drove them deeper into the Carolina backcountry with little rest. He cared nothing for their grumbling. He believed speed would deliver victory. "We will catch Morgan before he scurries across the broad river," he told his officers, his pale eyes gleaming. To fail was unthinkable. Cornwallis expected results. Morgan, meanwhile, felt the weight of responsibility with every mile. His body betrayed him daily, racked by rheumatism and stomach pain that left him sleepless. Yet his mind was as sharp as ever. He knew Tarleton would pursue with reckless haste. Morgan had no illusions about the disparity of force. His 1,000 men were a patchwork of militia, Continentals, and volunteers, many barely trained. But he trusted them, and he trusted his own judgment. He had seen battles lost, because commanders demanded what men could not deliver. He would ask only what they could do, no more. He gathered his militia commanders at campfires in the chill January nights. Andrew Pickens, calm and respected among the backcountry men, assured him that the militia would stand if given clear orders. John Eager Howard, steady and methodical, promised his Maryland Continentals would not yield an inch unless ordered. William Washington, cousin to the commander-in-chief, polished his sword and grinned, certain his cavalry could match Tarleton's dragoons. Morgan listened, weighed their words, and resolved to fight, not by meeting Tarleton on equal terms, but by turning the Englishman's aggression against him. As Tarleton's column tramped forward, the countryside shuddered. Farmers hid livestock in the woods, women drove children into the hills, and the rumor spread that bloody Tarleton was coming. His reputation preceded him. At Waxhaws, surrendering Americans had been cut down by his men. True or not, the tale had hardened into legend. Militiamen spoke of him with hatred, swearing they would avenge murdered comrades if they faced him in the field. Morgan understood the value of such anger, but he also knew raw passion could scatter as quickly as it flared. Thus the hunters drove on, muskets glinting in the weak winter sun, boots cutting frozen earth. The hunted gathered in the open pastures of Cowpens, a place where cattle drovers had once camped. There, Morgan decided, he would turn and face the wolf at his heels. The trap was not yet sprung, but the lines were closing. Tarleton's men believed they drove a tired fox before them. In truth, they pursued an old wagoner who had led men through a lifetime of wars and who now prepared to write his masterpiece upon the cold ground of South Carolina. Chapter 2. Morgan's Masterpiece. Daniel Morgan rose before dawn, stiff in his joints, breath hanging in the frosty air. Around him the camp stirred slowly, men stamping feet for warmth, horses snorting clouds into the pale morning. The Cowpens lay quiet, a broad meadow cut by rolling ground, open enough for maneuvers yet broken by slight rises that could mask movement. To the untrained eye it was nothing but pasture land. To Morgan it was a gift. He studied the ground with the care of a gambler weighing his final hand. Tarleton would come straight on, as he always did. There would be no subtle maneuver, no careful probe. He would attack headlong, confident that militia would scatter. That arrogance was Morgan's advantage, if his men held long enough. If they gave the redcoats one sharp taste of steel before falling back, Tarleton would throw in reserves too soon, press too hard, and stumble into ruin. That evening Morgan summoned his officers. They gathered close to the fire, faces flickering orange, eyes fixed on him. He laid out the plan with the blunt clarity of a man who despised wasted words. The first line would be the riflemen, picked men with long rifles, spread out ahead to sting the enemy's advance. Their task was to aim at officers, harass the British column, and then slip back through the lines. Behind them stood Andrew Picken's militia, drawn up across the pasture. Morgan turned to them directly. "Give me 2 good volleys," he told them, his voice low but steady. "Aim well, then fall back. Don't wait to be cut down. Fire, retire in order, that's all I ask." Their path of retreat was secure. Howard's Continentals would open lanes in their ranks to let the militia pass through, then close the gap seamlessly, ready to face the British head-on. The militia nodded. They liked him. He led from authority, not power. Unlike other generals, Morgan did not scorn them as cowards. He demanded what they could do, not what they could not. 2 volleys was within reach. The third line, waiting in silence, would be John Eager Howard's Continentals, battle-hardened men who had stared down the king's soldiers before. These were chiefly the Maryland and Delaware Continentals, remnants of units that had fought since the earliest days of the war. At Brandywine, Germantown, and Monmouth, they had stood in the storm of British volleys and answered with their own. They had marched barefoot, endured winters without pay or shoes, and learned the hard lessons of discipline drilled into them by Baron von Steuben at Valley Forge. Their ranks were thinner now than in those days, but the men who remained were tested survivors. They knew the weight of a British bayonet charge and the sound of artillery shells tearing the earth around them. Their faded blue coats and worn equipment concealed an iron core of confidence, for they had faced the worst and endured. When Howard's Continentals leveled muskets, it was with the steady assurance of soldiers who had already written their loyalty in blood across 6 battlefields. And behind all, William Washington's cavalry waited, hidden from sight. At the moment of crisis, Morgan would unleash them like a hammer against the enemy's rear. Morgan's eyes glowed as he spoke of them. He knew that well-timed cavalry could turn a wavering fight into a rout. Every piece was in its place, perfectly suited to the men who would carry it out. He ended with a speech to the assembled ranks. "You are not fighting today for me," he growled, his voice rough as gravel. "You are fighting for yourselves, for your homes, your wives, your children. Do your duty, and the day will be ours." A murmur ran through the camp. Men tightened belts, cleaned muskets, and whispered quiet prayers. Some carved initials into powder horns. Others checked the fit of their shoes, pulling straps tight. A few wore blue coats faded with age, but most had hunting shirts or plain homespun jackets. They looked like farmers and tradesmen, yet there was a quiet current of confidence among them. Morgan moved easily from group to group, speaking with a directness that made men trust him. "To the militia," he said with a half-smile, "all I ask is 2 good shots, then you can fall back. Do that, and when you go home you can tell the girls you stood in the line and fired at the king's men. They'll love you for it." Laughter rippled through the ranks, breaking the tension, and even the anxious grinned at the thought. As the firelight died and silence settled, Morgan lingered, staring into the darkness where Tarleton's men marched. He knew the Englishman was coming hard, driving his troops with merciless speed. That suited him. A tired army, strung out on the march, would strike without order. By morning, the pasture at Cowpens would no longer be quiet. Morgan had set his board, arranged his pieces. Now he waited for his opponent to play the only game he knew. Chapter 3, The First Shots. The pale winter sun lifted slowly over the horizon, spilling weak light across the Cowpens. Frost clung to the grass, crunching under boots as Morgan's men moved into position. Out in front, scattered along the rise, crouched the riflemen. Frontier marksmen from Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, their long rifles balanced on forked sticks or steady across their knees. Morgan knew how to use such men better than any officer in the Continental Army. At Saratoga, his rifle corps had helped break Burgoyne's advance, cutting down officers and sapping the British will to fight. Now, though he commanded only a small detachment of riflemen, he would employ them with the same deadly precision. The first to encounter them were Tarleton's scouts. Riding ahead of the main column, they pushed into the pasture expecting to sweep the ground clear. Instead, the still morning air cracked with the whip of rifle fire. A British officer pitched out of the saddle, another man dropped hard into the frozen grass, and the vanguard staggered in confusion. Horses screamed, rearing at the sudden shock, while the rest of the scouts scattered back down the rise. The riflemen did not fire in neat volleys. They picked targets with deliberate care, aiming for mounted men, officers, and drummers. Another round of shots tore through the advancing light infantry, striking down leaders, throwing companies into disarray, and forcing Tarleton's men to deploy faster than he intended. Every few steps forward brought another stinging crack of fire, another officer slumping from the saddle, another unit slowing to reform. The British cursed them as bushfighters, unchivalrous foes who shot from cover and fought outside the rules of European drill. Yet they could not deny the accuracy or the effect. For long minutes the riflemen harassed the vanguard, slowing, frustrating, and unbalancing the advance. Then, with the main British line closing, they obeyed Morgan's orders. Slipping back through the gaps prepared in the militia line, they reformed behind Pickens' men, ready to fight again when the moment was right. Now Andrew Pickens' militia stood revealed, waiting in their line across the pasture. They gripped muskets tight, eyes locked on the red column advancing through the smoke of the riflemen's retreat. A heartbeat of silence, then the sharp crash of a volley split the air. British light infantry staggered under the blow, men tumbling in heaps. Almost at once a second volley followed, more disciplined and deadly than Tarleton had expected. Officers shouted, drums beat furiously, and still the scarlet ranks wavered. As ordered, Pickens' men turned and began to fall back. To Tarleton's troops, the sight was all too familiar. Patriot militia had broken before them at Camden, at Waxhaws, and in skirmishes all across the Carolinas. Officers shouted with excitement, "They run!" Another rout. The red line surged forward, drums pounding, bayonets lowered, convinced they would sweep the field in moments and carry home another quick victory. Tarleton himself spurred his horse, rising in the stirrups as he shouted, "Press them! Forward, lads, the field is ours!" His blade flashed above his head as he urged his men on, certain he was about to trample Morgan's ragged corps in the same fashion he had scattered rebels so many times before. But it was no rout. The militia moved with practiced steadiness, filing neatly through the open lanes Howard's Continentals had prepared for them. Once the last militiamen passed through, the gaps closed like a trap snapping shut. Howard's veterans raised muskets in unison, their faces set, waiting for the British to blunder headlong into their fire. Howard gave his own command. The Continentals stepped forward, muskets leveled, their bayonets gleaming in the cold light. As the first wave of British troops stumbled into range, a withering volley roared from the American line. Men crumpled, smoke rolled, and for a moment the British advance faltered. To the rear, William Washington leaned in his saddle, watching. His cavalry pawed the ground, eager, but he waited for Morgan's signal. The battle had only begun, and the snare was not yet closed. Tarleton, undeterred, rode among his men, cursing, urging them on. The sight of militia melting away convinced him victory was at hand. He pressed harder, driving his weary troops straight into the teeth of Morgan's trap. Chapter 4. The Crisis. The field at Cowpens was choked with smoke. Acrid powder burned the air, stung the eyes, coated tongues with bitterness. The crash of volleys rolled like thunder, punctuated by the cries of the wounded. Tarleton's infantry pushed forward in dense ranks, bayonets fixed, drums beating the relentless advance. John Eager Howard's Continentals bore the weight of that assault. They stood in steady lines, coats faded, cartridge boxes thinning, yet their discipline held. Volley after volley ripped through the scarlet ranks. British officers, swords raised, urged their men onward through the slaughter, closing the distance until it seemed bayonets would soon meet in savage thrusts. Morgan rode behind the lines, bellowing encouragement. His horse snorted and tossed its head, startled by the concussive blasts, but the old wagoner sat firm in the saddle. "Hold, boys, hold," he shouted. "Give them one more and they're ours." His voice, gravelly and sure, steadied men who might have wavered, but the British pressed harder still. Tarleton's dragoons slashed at the flanks. The weight of numbers began to tell. Howard gave a sharp order. His right company should fall back a few paces to dress the line. In the choking smoke, the command spread unevenly. Other companies, seeing movement, believed a retreat had been ordered. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the American line began to edge rearward. Tarleton saw it and roared with triumph. He spurred forward, saber flashing, certain the rebels were breaking at last. Now! Now! Push them, lads! The redcoats surged, bayonets lowered, hearts pounding with the scent of victory. For a moment the battle hung by a thread. Some Continentals faltered, faces pale, eyes darting toward the rear. Militia, who had reformed behind the lines, whispered anxiously, wondering if the day was lost. Tarleton's officers sensed the crack and drove their men harder. In that instant, history itself teetered. If the Continentals had collapsed, the revolution might have ended on this frozen pasture. Morgan, seeing the shift, galloped to Howard. The Marylander, calm amid the chaos, explained what had happened, an orderly fallback mistaken for retreat. Morgan understood in an instant. His plan teetered on the edge of collapse, but it could still be saved. Riding the length of the line, Morgan thundered commands, his words cutting through the din. "Face about! Fire at will!" He raised his arm and pointed forward, a signal for every man to turn. The Continentals halted, pivoted, leveled muskets. In that instant of reversal, as the British charged recklessly into the smoke, the trap began to close. Chapter 5. The Trap Springs. The moment of decision came with a flash of steel and smoke. Howard's Continentals, who had seemed to give ground, suddenly wheeled about on Morgan's signal. At point-blank range, they fired as one, the volley crashing into the British ranks with murderous effect. Dozens of redcoats fell in an instant, and the rest reeled under the shock. From the flanks, Andrew Picken's militia poured back into the fight. Their muskets spat fire, bullets tearing into exposed sides. What had looked like a rebel rout now revealed itself as a deliberate snare. The British line, already battered, began to buckle under the crossfire. Then came the thunder of hooves. William Washington, waiting for this instant, drove his cavalry forward. His dragoons burst from behind a rise, sabers drawn, voices raised in a wild yell that echoed across the pasture. They struck the British rear with irresistible force, cutting down men, scattering units, and trampling those who tried to stand. Panic spread like a contagion. British soldiers threw down muskets, some crying for quarter, others fleeing in blind terror. Tarleton's famed legion was being torn apart before his eyes. Amid the chaos, Tarleton tried to rally a knot of horsemen. He cursed, shouted, waved his sword, anything to stem the tide, but the field was already lost. Still, he refused to abandon the fight. With a cluster of dragoons at his side, he pushed back into the melee, desperate to carve a path through the storm. Washington, at the head of his horsemen, saw him clearly. Here was the enemy commander, the very man whose name had become a byword for cruelty in the Carolinas. With no hesitation, Washington spurred his horse, driving straight into Tarleton's band. Their sabers met with a clang of steel, sparks flying as the two leaders closed in hand to hand. Around them the battle still raged, redcoats falling, Americans pressing, cavalry slashing, but in that moment, all eyes nearby fixed on the duel between the Virginian and the Englishman. The trap had sprung, and Morgan had accomplished what few commanders in history ever managed, a true double envelopment. Yet even as the British line collapsed on every side, the personal clash between Washington and Tarleton was just beginning, destined to echo as loudly as the volleys that had shattered Britain's ranks. Chapter 6. The Duel. The battlefield at Cowpens had broken apart into chaos. Redcoats fleeing in every direction, muskets discarded, drums silent. Yet in the midst of the rout, two figures refused to yield. William Washington, saber raised, urged his horse straight at the knot of British dragoons who still clung to their commander. And at the center of that knot was Banastre Tarleton, his face streaked with sweat and powder, eyes blazing with fury. The clash was sudden and violent. Their sabers met with a crash of steel, the force of the blows sending sparks into the smoky air. Washington swung hard, his blade carving down across Tarleton's hand, severing two fingers. Tarleton reeled, blood splattering the pommel of his sword, but he fought on, teeth clenched, refusing to surrender the field. Around them, dragoons hacked and slashed, horses screamed, men grappled and fired pistols at point-blank range. Washington pressed his advantage, saber darting again and again. A British trooper lunged at him from the side, blade aimed for his ribs, but at that instant, Washington's young orderly fired. The boy, scarcely more than a youth, and said by some to be of African descent, leveled his pistol and shot the trooper dead. The British horseman toppled from the saddle, saving Washington's life in that heartbeat. Tarleton, desperate and wounded, drew a pistol with his good hand. He wheeled his horse away from Washington and fired over his shoulder. The shot struck true, not Washington, but his mount. The animal screamed, staggered, and collapsed, pitching its rider violently into the churned mud. For an instant the battle seemed to hang in silence. Washington sprawled on the ground, Tarleton bloodied but mounted, ready to strike again. But Washington's dragoons surged to him, pulling him up, pressing another horse into his grasp. He swung into the saddle, saber once more flashing in his hand. Tarleton, seeing his foe unbroken, spurred furiously into the distance. His men thrust a fresh horse beneath him, dragging him from the melee before Washington could close again. Thus the duel ended, not with capture or death, but with Tarleton's flight. Bloodied, missing fingers, and humiliated, he galloped away with a ragged remnant of his legion, leaving the field, and his reputation, in ruins. For Morgan's men, the duel became the story they told long after the battle. They remembered the general, Strap, the devastating volley, the cavalry charge, but above all, they remembered the moment when William Washington and Banastre Tarleton met in the smoke, sabers flashing, and the Revolution's cause was carried on the edge of a blade. Epilogue: A field remembered. When the smoke finally cleared over Cowpens, the battlefield was unrecognizable. Muskets lay scattered among the frosted grass, drum corps silenced, and the dead and wounded of both armies marked the cost of a single morning's fight. Yet for those who had stood under Morgan's command, the victory was unmistakable, a testament to discipline, courage, and cunning. Daniel Morgan, pale and bent with illness, dismounted and walked among his men. He shook hands, offered quiet words of praise, and allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. He had gambled everything on the clever use of terrain, timing, and trust in his soldiers, and the gamble had paid off. Andrew Picken's militia, once doubted, had fired and fallen back as planned, only to surge forward at the decisive moment. Howard's Continentals had held the line, steady as stone. William Washington's cavalry had ridden like thunder to strike the enemy rear. Every piece of the plan had come together in perfect harmony. Tarleton returned to Cornwallis with what remained of his command, humiliated and enraged. His reputation for invincibility had been shattered. His rashness had delivered disaster. Cornwallis would never forget Cowpens, and neither would the world. For Greene, the victory reinforced the Southern strategy: harass, delay, and wear down the British, forcing them into overextension. For the Revolution, Cowpens became a beacon, a clear demonstration that ingenuity and determination could triumph over superior numbers and reputation. Years later, when the story was told, Cowpens would be remembered as more than a battle. It became a symbol of the power of leadership, planning, and courage under fire. Visitors to that quiet South Carolina pasture would walk where men had fallen and risen, and they would feel the echo of gunfire, the roar of cavalry, and the steady, commanding voice of a general who had turned the course of a war with nothing more than his mind, his men, and a frozen winter morning. History had marked Cowpens indelibly, and the lesson endured: careful preparation, trust in one's soldiers, and the courage to strike decisively could change the fate of nations.